Welcome to the Utah State Historical Society day-long symposium entitled Creating Greater Salt Lake, History, Landscape, and Urban Design. My name is Brad Westwood. I'm Director of State History. We are fortunate, now in introducing our speaker, to have Andrew Needham, Associate Professor of History at New York University. Professor Needham developed an interest in changing landscapes during a childhood marked by long car rides across upper Midwest America, usually to small nature preserves with names like Mosquito Hill, surrounded by dairy farmlands. It was from this same location, the back seat of a car, that Andrew drove past Four Corners Power Plant in his early 20s. That experience spurred a question: what is that doing here? That eventually spawned his first book, Power Lines, Phoenix and the Making of Modern Southwest, published by Princeton University in 2014. Power Lines tells the story of an intimate connection between the growing metropolis of Phoenix and the supposedly undeveloped Navajo Nation, forged by infrastructure built to generate and transmit electrical power. Power Lines has won 5 separate book awards. His current research projects is exploring the intersection of infrastructure, sustainability, and so forth. Needham holds a BA from Northwestern University, an MA from San Francisco State, a PhD from University of Michigan. He has taught at SMU, Bard College, and now New York University, where he teaches classes on the American West, urban history, environmental history, and American Indian history. His address today is Beyond the Metropolis, Remapping American Urban History. Welcome to the stand, please, Dr. Needham.
Thank you much. I'd like to just open by thanking Brad for that, really wonderful introduction, and thanks to Jedediah and Brad and everyone at the Utah Division of State History for inviting me out here and hosting me. Thanks to Lisa Buckmiller for handling all the complicated logistics in getting from New York City to Salt Lake City. And thanks to all of you for coming today to what I think is a really fascinating and interesting symposium. I'd like to begin today with a question that seems simple. Where does the city begin and end? Slides like this offer a pretty simple answer. That way. Or that way, actually. But as I hope to show you, when you attempt to answer that question within the metropolitan geography built over at least the past half century, that becomes a deceptively complicated question. In the geography we've labeled with names like Central Business District, Neighborhood, Industrial Enterprise Zone, Inner Ring Suburb, Exurb, Wilderburb, urban boundaries become difficult to determine. Add in regional recreational centers, irrigation and water districts, electrical transmission networks, ecological biomes, and the borders become even more difficult to see. At this symposium dedicated to the project of figuring out ways to explain the development, history, and landscape of Greater Salt Lake, it seems to me that the act of determining the ways in which you want to rethink the borders of Salt Lake and Salt Lake City, and thereby rethink the stories that you tell about it, lies at the center of the actual inquiry. It's the different determinations that people will make today about where Greater Salt Lake begins and ends that are going to bracket the stories that people tell. They'll explain the relationships between geography and history and will determine the space in which change matters. In short, maps kind of help locate, both locate the action and kind of determine why it matters. So today I'd like to talk about some various ways to map metropolitan America in time and suggest how some perhaps unexpected maps might lead us to broader notions of who, what, and where is included in the stories we tell about metropolitan and urban America and the spaces that surround it. I'm going to start with 4 maps of Salt Lake and the broader history that underlies those maps, and then, since all of you know far more about the history of Salt Lake City than I do, I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to kind of talk about broadening how broadening the scale of metropolitan history suggests different stories of cities and their surrounding environments, talking mainly about the history and geography of what we might think of as Greater Phoenix, which I do know something about, and which just might all suggest maybe be part of one story we could tell of Greater Salt Lake. Many of the first geographic renderings of not only Salt Lake City, but American cities in general took this form, known as the bird's eye. As a means of displaying landscape, bird's eyes emerged in part from the advent of hot air balloons and the ability to kind of rise up and visualize the city from above. But more importantly, they represented a way of imagining the present and future scales of late 19th century American cities. In a moment when many European cities were still bounded by walls, I'm co-teaching a class this semester with a colleague who does the history of Paris, and he mentioned to me that something I had not known, that Paris until 1890 was ringed by a defined wall that set the end, the very end of the city. That's something very foreign to American cities. American cities, by contrast, promise to stretch forth, bringing new spaces into the city. And it's not just Salt Lake where the bounds of the city stretch forth really kind of almost off the frame. This famous bird's eye of Chicago, drawn in 1881, a decade after the fire, shows the bustling area of the waterfront with the city stretching forth unbounded, really, onto the plains of the Great West. American cities in this view were destined to conquer the space that surrounded them. They stood for the expansive ambitions that led city boosters in the 19th century to often use words like empire to describe their vision. These maps, if we can even call them maps, however, aren't actually that useful if you want to get places within the city. So let's move forward about 30 years after that map of that bird's eye of Salt Lake into the early automobile age. This is a 1920 map created by a company called Perry Castaneda of downtown Salt Lake. Again, this map is not unique. You could find similar maps for almost any city in the U.S., and it reflects the fact that this particular urban space was particularly important and required help navigating. That downtown, it represents that downtown represented a place of important action, of various sorts of power, and therefore of congestion, where finding one's way to the right place rather quickly was important. These maps allowed navigation of the small spaces of downtown, but don't do much, or as I've learned, the rather large, some of the blocks here seem to be larger than I expect from New York City blocks, just from walking around. So these maps allow the navigation of the small spaces of downtown, but don't do much to represent the breadth of metropolitan space, which brings me to the next map, the map of the elegantly named Salt Lake City, Ogden, Provo Metropolitan Statistical Area, or MSA, which probably represents today the standard way for social scientists, at least, to map metropolitan America, or what we might call greater urban space. Maps like these represented the Census Bureau's recognition that both urban political boundaries or county boundaries, which had been the main way that the census had enumerated things up until the 1940 census, did a poor job of reflecting both urbanized population and urban development in an era when suburban development in many places was becoming a reality that was kind of increasingly ringing cities. Beginning in 1940, the Census Bureau began defining MSAs as separate entities. They broke MSAs up into discrete tracts in which they could measure population, average income, housing age and type, race, family composition, and a vast array of other statistical measures. Today, the census is recording of population, employment, housing, and other statistics within the 381 MSAs that they count as distinct entities. It's every discrete population center of over 50,000 counts as a metropolitan statistical area for the census, has been invaluable for scholars of metropolitan America. The tract-level statistics have enabled detailed examinations of land use, race and wealth, development, housing in space and over time. And yet, and you knew there was probably going to be an and yet because there's one map remaining, these maps have also hindered our ability to appreciate the scale and scope of changes associated with metropolitan growth. The MSA as a category has the effect of kind of narrowing the vision of scholars of metropolitan America. They serve to kind of sever the particular MSAs from the territory that surrounds them. And you often see these kinds of maps of MSAs with, kind of detailed boundaries and then just kind of, roads disappearing off into somewhere else with little seeming connection. So they kind of sever the particular MSAs from the territory that surrounds them and from the representation and from the relationships that those kind of connections represent. It creates the danger of an analysis of metropolitan areas that exist as islands, to be studied in comparison with each other, but in geographic isolation from the broader landscapes that are embedded within. To suggest what's lost, I'd like to turn to the final map. This one, a schematic map of the extra high voltage power lines that crisscross the Southwest in 1970. And this is actually a map of both present and future development. So one of the things you'll notice here is a planned power plant on the Kaparowitz Plateau that was never actually built. But what you see in this map is population centers of the West: Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, to Denver, Salt Lake City up here, to Los Angeles, Las Vegas, somewhere in this nexus. Surround with a series of power plants located in the middle. So Four Corners and San Juan Power Plant, Cholla Power Plant, Navajo Generating Station, Mojave is over here somewhere. All of them located at the center of this landscape. So we see here a kind of map of greater metropolitan space in the West, the way that these cities, these population centers became connected in deep ways to energy resources and energy development at the kind of really unseen center of northern Arizona, southern Utah, western New Mexico, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I've showed four maps: what we might think of as imperial bird's eye maps, downtown maps, metropolitan maps, and maps that trace power lines. And I'd like to spend the rest of my time thinking about how the relationships of maps like these to the stories, kind of the relationship we can tell about these maps to the development and stories of development in Phoenix. These aren't the only maps I could use. There could be maps of migration patterns, maps of political representation, maps of business development, maps of religious denomination. And those maps would tell different stories in different cities. But hopefully looking at how these maps tell stories about Phoenix suggests some of the various ways you might narrate the history of Greater Salt Lake and the stakes involved at that. So, turning to Phoenix and a bird's eye map of Phoenix. Phoenix is a relatively new city. It's not founded until the late 1860s. And as this bird's eye from 1885 suggests, it remained a small city for much of its history. Phoenix at this point is about 1,200 people, and it remains relatively small for a long time. Even in 1940, Phoenix only had 65,000 people, which, if you think about kind of Phoenix today, is rather startling and remarkable. Its civic boosters still had imperial desires, but those desires were mostly thwarted because Phoenix's growth depended in part on the ability to claim water. An early governor of Arizona, George Hunt, said, here you see George Hunt in his terrific mustache, he said, "The Colorado River is our great resource," and he very much hit "our" hard in this statement. And unless we conserve it and get the maximum benefit from it, we can depend on becoming a sort of veriform appendix to Los Angeles, instead of becoming one of the great empire states of our nation. Here you see the kind of the imperial language that I was talking about before. George Hunt was able to play such sentiments to maximum political advantage. He returned to political power after a kind of decade in the relative political exile around statehood, by claiming that California was stealing the water that rightfully belonged to Arizona. Jesus walked on water, one political wag joked, but George Hunt ran on the Colorado River. As Hunt's words and the bird's eye that preceded it suggested, Phoenicians possessed imperial impulses toward growth, but those impulses were mostly thwarted in its early years. So let's turn to a second image. Let's turn to downtown. So here's a photo of downtown Phoenix in 1955. Metropolitan Phoenix, for those of you who have been there today, sprawls across the Valley of the Sun, making kind of many of the kind of small cities that compose its landscape relatively indistinct. Kind of multiple centers of power, many new centers of shopping, commerce, office parks, kind of located seemingly willy-nilly. It's oftentimes tough to know exactly where you are in metropolitan Phoenix. But in the years immediately following the war, downtown was a hive of activity that would help to produce its growth. It was the home of Valley National Bank, which you see the kind of up here on the sign up on the top, the largest bank in the Intermountain West. A block to the west of this image lay Goldwater's department store, whose owner, Barry Goldwater, had only 3 years before this photo was taken kind of become Arizona's junior senator. And a block to the east was the office of this man, a man named Frank Snell, in the law firm of Snell and Wilmer, which became the largest law firm in post-war Phoenix. This man, Frank Snell, occupied a role as, in one contemporary's words, the original dark glasses man. Snell acted as one of the main power brokers in a city where the Chamber of Commerce largely set the terms of local government. That control allowed Snell, in the words of one historian, quote, to sit down for lunch at the Arizona Club with a few friends and develop either public or private policy for Phoenix as the occasion demanded. Those policies, and this is a kind of familiar story across a lot of kind of metropolitan areas in the post-war years, this kind of tight control of local government, by kind of local business elites. In Phoenix, as in many of these other places, those policies focused on drawing new businesses, particularly aerospace, communications, and high-tech Cold War mainstays. Control of local government and increasingly state government, as Phoenix swelled in population, allowed Snell and others to offer land grants, tax breaks, and protection against labor disruption to firms that saw such policies as economically and ideologically beneficial. And Snell and his compatriots aimed for a particular kind of business. We did not want dirty industries. We were very particular about that, Snell told an interviewer later. The Phoenix Chamber of Commerce filled its promotional materials with code words describing the types of industry it sought to attract to Phoenix: light, clean, suitable, smoke-free. One publication explained, "The emphasis with industry in metropolitan Phoenix is on cleanliness. Here, no ugly smokestacks insult the Arizona sky. No growl of monotonous machines harshly stamp their audible imprint." And such appeals were incredibly successful. Manufacturing income grew in Phoenix from $5 million to $435 million between 1940 and 1960. When you read the reports of manufacturing in 1940, in Phoenix, one of the main industries is broom manufacturing, which is not exactly a mainstay of the military-industrial complex. But Phoenix indeed became home to mainstays of that part of the economy, which sprawled in massive plants, which, like the Sperry Phoenix plant you see built here, on either farmland or undeveloped land kind of throughout the valley. In short, policies made in downtown helped to transform a place that had been known earlier in the 20th century as the Salt River Valley into the Valley of the Sun. But it was not only downtown that the Valley of the Sun was made. Now I'm moving on to the third map, the Metropolitan map. Moving on to that map of the MSA in your imagination, I'd like to turn attention to a figure who worked not so much downtown, though he did rely on Valley National Bank and other entities downtown to help him fund his home construction business, but on the city's expanding periphery. This is John F. Lon, the largest home builder in post-war Phoenix, and for a time the second largest home builder in the United States, trailing only the Levitt brothers, of Levittown on Long Island and in suburban Philadelphia. He got his start immediately after World War II when he started a small contracting business in the city that then numbered under 100,000 people. It began with one home. It took us 6 months to build it, he recalled, and then we had an opportunity to sell it before we had it finished. Selling the house for $8,450 long made a profit of $4,500. He repeated the process with multiple homes. As he told an interviewer in 2000, he sold about 12 homes before we finally got to move into our own. At least as he tells the story, he was continually trying to build a family home, only to have it, have an offer that he couldn't refuse and sell it out kind of from under his family and then move on to the next home. By the early 1950s, Long had become a suburban developer, purchasing agricultural land, dividing it into smaller plots, ranging from 30 to 90 houses, and building homes upon it. In 1955, he pursued an even grander vision, a planned community called Maryvale, where 12,000 inexpensive homes on the western edges of Phoenix would be interspersed with parks and swimming pools and recreation buildings and so forth, designed so that, as he said, the whole spectrum of living could be in one area. Photos of that development, of what he called the greatest home show on earth to advertise Maryvale. This is one of my favorite photos in the way that it contains this kind of lone cul-de-sac plopped down in the middle of the farm fields of West Phoenix. And Long remembered he was so eager to begin construction in Maryvale that he paid the cantaloupe farmer whose land he had purchased, not only for the land, but also he added a payment on the top for the crop so that he could then proceed by, as he said, we disked it and all of that, grinding the cantaloupes into the earth so that homes could kind of sprout anew from this farm field. And here we were having our grand opening. These homes were filled with a broad range of electrical appliances. Here you see John Long with Ronald Reagan in 1958 after Maryvale had been awarded a GE Gold Star Award for making the most extensive use of electrical living for its residents. This is certainly not unique. These kinds of awards, the kind of rhetoric that declared electrical appliances as labor-saving and making life easier not only for families but for women in particular, were kind of rampant across post-war America. This is my personal favorite. I always tell people that this is a terrible idea to actually give someone an electrical Valentine that helps her live better electrically. That the fine print is hard to read, but it essentially says that your wife will be overjoyed when you show up on Valentine's Day with a new dryer. The result of this, on the grand scale, was a dramatic increase in residential electrical use in Phoenix, with the average home in Phoenix increasing its electrical consumption from 1,400 kilowatts annually to over 11,000 kilowatts in the years between 1945 and 1970. That spike you see at the end, my best guess is that spike you see at the very end of the graph is the moment when kind of refrigeration as air conditioning kind of replaces swamp coolers as the main way of cooling houses in Phoenix. This per capita usage didn't represent the universal experience of Phoenix. Indeed, the story of Phoenix's post-war development, like the story of metropolitan America at large, is one of profound inequality. Almost 95% of the houses sold in Maryvale received insurance from either the Federal Housing Authority or the Veterans Administration under the GI Bill. FHA underwriting standards, as a generation of historians have shown, were also profoundly racist. Administrators' belief that the presence of blacks or Mexican Americans represented threats to property value meant that only 3 African Americans and less than 200 people with Spanish surnames, which is the way that the 1960 census counts Latinos, lived in Maryvale as of 1960. Even Willie Mays, in town for spring training with the Giants in 1958, could find only rental homes available for him in South Phoenix. Like Mays, the vast majority of non-white residents of Phoenix lived in the older parts of the city. Neighborhoods that one journalist explained looked like a cross between a Mississippi Black Belt Negro ghetto and a Mexican border town. Streets are unpaved, sewers unconnected, and public utilities inadequate. Many houses have outdoor toilets, many houses are no better than outhouses. Needless to say, such homes lack the range of electrical appliances found in suburban North Phoenix. And leaving those neighborhoods of South Phoenix, here you see kind of the Spanish surname population. And, this, I think, gives an idea of what kind of the census's MSA statistics allow you to do, really to kind of map, race in time at a particular moment in time. So here's the Spanish surname population. Here's the African American population of Phoenix, and you'll see them concentrated, in these kind of census blocks of South Phoenix, which are the oldest part of the city, the place where kind of industries like slaughterhouses had located in the early parts of the city's history. Leaving those neighborhoods represented a risk. If you were Black or Hispanic, a man named John Camargo remembered, you couldn't go north of Van Buren. You would drive through there and would just be risking a fight with white kids that were in that area, and even older whites that, didn't like Blacks and Hispanics. So, this is a kind of familiar story of kind of metropolitan America, of the racialization, or the spatialization of race, in cities, the location of particular parts of the city as kind of the places where non-whites are able to live. So the MSA maps become, in effect, maps of inequality as well, that led us to see not only the scale of development of metropolitan America, but also its inequalities in space. But to return to the final map, it only allows us to appreciate those differences within the metropolitan borders as defined by the Census Bureau. This map, to go kind of back to sorry, I forgot to insert it. This map, suggests the connections and differences that lay beyond metropolitan borders, of an even greater map of metropolitan spaces that lay, in effect, beyond the metropolis. It also stands as a map of a solution to a problem created by the terms of growth in Phoenix and elsewhere in the American West. John Long and Frank Snell and others like them had helped fuel explosive growth that posed electrical use as central to modern life. They had also posed Phoenix as a new kind of city, one with clear skies and open vistas, so unlike the cities of the East Coast. How is this power to be supplied? For a time, hydroelectricity generated for Phoenix at Davis and Parker Dams and later at Glen Canyon, and natural gas power plants located near Phoenix met the need. But demand was far outpacing the supply available from those sources. Supplies of natural gas were limited by demand in California, kind of once again the competition with California kind of posing an issue for development in Arizona. The region had large supplies of coal located near the Four Corners and on Black Mesa on Navajo and Hopi land. But dirty, polluting coal represented, in a way, the antithesis of the vision of Phoenix as a clean city of outdoor living. The high-voltage power lines developed to carry hydroelectric power, however, presented a solution. And here's what that solution looked like. The Bureau of Reclamation, as early as 1952, which is where this slide comes from, began suggesting that power plants be built near coal mines with electricity, or coal by wire, as they called it, transmitted long distances via power lines. That year, in 1952, they predicted that coal would eventually come to supply 55% of the West's electrical needs, at a time when it only provided 5% of the electricity, and provided this map of what it might look like, a map of a 500,000 kilovolt system, in which power plants would be located in the Intermountain West. And sorry, Western Colorado, you are where all power is going to come from. And transmitted to metropolitan areas that lay, in the Bureau of Reclamation's imagination at least, on the various coasts. In effect, the Bureau was suggesting a new map of metropolitan space in which electrical consumption would be supplied by production hundreds of miles away, located on places where the dominant feature would become a power plant. This model was broadly embraced by the region's electrical utilities, with the important caveat that they aim to sideline ownership by the Bureau of Reclamation for private ownership. It was also embraced by the region's mining and construction industries. In 1954, Utah International, one of the 6 companies that had helped build Hoover Dam, signed an exploration lease for coal mined near the Four Corners, at a site the company would come to call Navajo Mine. 3 years later, in 1957, Arizona Public Service, the major private electrical utility serving Phoenix, agreed to build this power plant, Four Corners Power Plant, nearby. And it created the geography you see here, a map of metropolitan space with power lines running from coal deposits in western New Mexico and a power plant located nearby, 300 miles to the southwest to meet the burgeoning demand of consumers in Phoenix. This too, I'd suggest, is a map of metropolitan space, of the way that greater Phoenix transformed landscapes and created a new built environment far past the boundaries of Scottsdale or Fountain Hills or its very last exurb. There's one glaring question that I haven't addressed about this broader map of metropolitan space. The coal, the power plant, many miles of the power lines, as you see here, were located on Navajo tribal land. How did Navajos, both as a tribe and as individuals, respond to their rather sudden and uneven incorporation into metropolitan space, and an incorporation that became only more dense as multiple cities came by 1970 to embrace this model of where power would come from? And there's no simple answer to that question of how Navajos responded to it, because there's no single response. I'm going to highlight 2, however, to suggest some of the dynamics that come out of greater metropolitan space. This is Paul Jones. In 1954, the same year that Utah International established its lease for Navajo Mine, he was elected chairman of the Navajo tribe. And Jones really has a fascinating life. He spends most of his childhood herding sheep between the Chusca Mountains and the San Juan River Valley, kind of in a seasonal pattern. In his early teens, he meets a missionary family who convinces him and his family to allow him to attend high school off the reservation. He eventually attends high school in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, just across the Hudson from New York City. He serves in World War I. He's gassed in World War I. He works as a clerk in Chicago at the Board of Trade before eventually returning to the Navajo Reservation in the 1930s to serve as a translator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's a great biography to be written of Paul Jones. He's this kind of fascinatingly mobile figure. Jones was elected tribal chairman, however, in a moment of crisis. Federal Indian policy after World War II had a stated goal of termination, the elimination of federal trust responsibilities for Indian people and the abrogation of treaty rights at a moment when per capita Navajo income stood at 7% of the national average. Facing this combination of dire poverty and threats of federal termination, Jones regarded the new interest in coal as a sign of divine providence that had brought what he called unexpected wealth from natural resources not known to be there in our earlier history. Explaining the new development, he told the Navajo Times, "We are not going to let our people starve. We will give them as decent a living as we can within our power. This is the reason for the various projects, to get industry and drilling for gas, and we are able to do this." But Jones had a vision beyond mere salvation. He saw resource development as a stepping stone that would, in his words, make the Navajo tribe a force in the Southwest. In 1957, Utah International, as I mentioned, established Navajo Mine, agreeing to pay the tribe 15 cents per ton for coal used on the reservation and 20 cents per ton for coal used beyond it. The tribe promised to support the construction of Four Corners Power Plant. And at the groundbreaking for Four Corners, Jones explained that the plant would, we hope, attract many industries with new jobs for Navajo workers. It would also bring electrical service to Navajo people, perhaps not in the form of the many appliances that filled the homes of John Long, but providing at least 2 light bulbs for every Hogan. It would also, Jones hoped, create shared prosperity in the Southwest. The reservation's growth would be, quote, coupled with the further development of Phoenix, Tucson, and other cities. So this kind of mutual benefit spread across space in this vision. And the kind of opening of Four Corners really did, begin the creation of a new system for delivering electric power in the Southwest. As I mentioned, power plants would be located far from cities, power lines would carry electricity to waiting consumers who could avoid the problems of burning coal, airborne fly ash, mercury contamination, tailing piles, and other forms of pollution, while enjoying a steady supply of electrical power. And this system, as I've shown, expanded rapidly beyond merely Four Corners in Phoenix. By the early 1970s, 5 power plants ringed the Navajo Nation, and the electricity generated in those plants streamed not only to Phoenix, but Albuquerque, Los Angeles, Denver, and Salt Lake City. Salt Lake, in fact, forms a valuable winter market in this system when most of the other cities are consuming much less electricity particularly in the in this moment in year when the temperatures haven't spiked as much. So Salt Lake becomes really kind of important in the system for balancing demand. Paul Jones's hope for these developments went unrealized, however. Few industries relocated to Navajo land. Those that did, companies like BVD Underwear and Navajo Children's Furniture, did not provide the salaries or middle-class lifestyles that high-tech industry in Phoenix did. They also proved ephemeral, willing to shut down operations following worker protests or upon receiving more generous offers. What were left were the limited jobs in coal mining and power plant work as the best jobs in the Navajo Nation. Work in forms of production that left the landscape scarred by strip mines and ash tailing piles, while more than half of the residents of the Navajo Nation in 1975 remained without electricity. The dynamics and inequalities of this system led to the second response. By the early 1970s, people like John Redhouse, who you see here, had a new name for this system. They called it colonialism. Redhouse was born outside Farmington, New Mexico, in an area that would soon be downwind from Four Corners. He grew up knowing people dispossessed by Navajo mine. And by 1971, he was a leader of the National Indian Youth Congress. And like many young Navajo activists, he came to see the coal mines, power lines, and power plants as a malign force that destroyed land and lives, while bringing few material benefits to Indian people. And those who benefited, in his vision, were consumers in Los Angeles and Phoenix who, quote, destroyed our land so they can use electrical can openers and toothbrushes. By the time Redhouse spoke, many tribal officials agreed with this critique. Peter MacDonald, elected tribal president in 1970 and described by Mother Jones magazine soon after as the most powerful Indian in America, told the governors of the Southwest in 1971 that for too long we have seen unfair contracts for the exploitation of our resources and our people. We have seen our land scarred by mine sites so that the giant cities of our country can be too cool in summer and too warm in winter. MacDonald and Redhouse had very different prescriptions, however, for the malady of colonialism. MacDonald demanded a piece of the action, asking energy companies to tear up existing contracts and enter into joint ventures that would give the tribe a 50% share of profits. As cars stood in interminable gas lines in 1973, MacDonald spoke of the Navajo tribe joining with the Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Southern Ute, Hopi, and other energy-rich tribes to form an Indian OPEC, of creating a political form that would translate energy wealth into economic power and political sovereignty in new ways. For Redhouse and other youth activists, however, this was anathema. They objected to mining and power production itself. They presented energy development and their tribe's place in the greater Southwest as a story of inequality. They were poor because Phoenix and other cities were rich. In the words of one letter to the Navajo Times, the great white middle-class children of the Phoenix area are sustained by water and energy stolen from the Navajos. The same year this map of power lines was created, the newspaper Redhouse published presented an alternative map that visualized this sense of colonialism. It looked like this. You'll notice that images like this, presented, this is basically the same map visualized in different forms with a different sense of its effects. Images like this presented powerful arguments that proved effective at blocking future development. They did little, however, to change the geography already in place. In the meantime, these visions of energy development in Navajo politics have continued to clash up to the present day, and I'm happy to talk about that later, as Navajos have debated more than the vast majority of Americans the dynamics of energy, the future of coal, and whether the long reach of metropolitan America and space, the space they are a part of, can be turned to their own benefit. To conclude, I want to turn to this map and think once more of its relationship to the other maps. And it's tempting to think of those four maps as sequential maps, as part of a kind of, a story of change over time. And I think they are part of a story of change over time, but not one of replacement. I don't think it's accurate to think of it that way, because each of these maps, or at least the sentiments underlying them, remain present in this map. The imperial nature of the bird's eye view lies embedded in the reach by all of these cities for the energy resources that can sustain their populations. The map of downtown's dense political power exists in the organization of political and economic power and expertise that allowed Phoenix, and then other cities, to claim these resources. The map of metropolitan Phoenix remains within the explosive growth and demand that led to this map's creation. And the Navajo Death's Head map remains within this map's technical revelation of the spatial dynamics of who has power and who doesn't, of who experiences pollution and who doesn't within the greater Southwest. The historian Phil Ethington writes that history takes and makes place. This seems highly relevant to us today. He means that the changes that we call history happen in particular places. Location matters for why change happens. But history also makes new places that the people that follow live within and make sense of. The past, he writes, is the set of places made by human action. History is a map of these places. I think this symposium suggests that we are just at the start of that process. Mapping Greater Salt Lake, I think, is part of a process of mapping history anew. Not to erase what has gone before, but to broaden it, to explain more fully the way that human actions in space over time have made the places that are seen and unseen, of metropolitan America that we live in today. Thank you.